All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, we're sitting down with our friend Bruce Epperly, who was actually on the show about a month ago. And he's back today to talk to us about my favorite holiday, my favorite time of the year, Christmas. And so, Bruce, welcome back, my friend. It's great to have you one more time.
Well, it's good to be here. I bring you greetings from Washington, D.C., the Jerusalem and Rome of our time, whereas there's nothing but chaos where I come from, and where, however, Hallmark movies are already there. I've seen the Hallmark Kiss and seen the great Christmas stories of happily ever after, so I'm ready to talk about Christmas too.
There you go. We are recording this the day after Election Day. So, we were just talking before we recorded that mayhem is breaking out everywhere. So, it'll be nice to talk about something relaxed, right?
Well, nothing's more relaxing than the Incarnation.
Right. well, we'll see. We'll see where it all goes. But I have to say, before we go into that, the conversation that we had the last time about your book, "The Elephant Is Running," is probably one of the most popular episodes I've released this year. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it has the most downloads because only about a month ago, but it's received the most feedback. Like I can't tell you, and it's all good. Nothing negative has come. No arrows have come my way. But I can't tell you how many people have reached out to me and I've said that that particular conversation introduced so much freedom into their walk with the divine that they didn't really even know was possible. So that book, our conversation, is really impacting people, and I wanted to take a moment just to say thank you for the work that you're doing.
Well, and I think that theology should be freeing. On occasion, I get a little nervous when somebody says, I've just found Jesus, and I'm worried that they're all of a sudden going to have a much smaller world than they did the day before.
Hmm.
Because often Christianity, including our understanding of the life, death, and resurrection, the birth of Jesus, is often constricts our worldview rather than expands it. So I'm delighted that there's been a good response to The Elephant is Running. It was a joy to write it, and certainly I'm always delighted to talk about it.
Yeah, it's so good. And I've spent some time scrolling through Amazon because you have a lot of books. Like I thought you had maybe 4 or 5 books. So I went to look and the list just doesn't end. There's just so much stuff there that you are doing. And I think it's just fantastic work that you're doing. So bravo to you.
Well, yes, and these days, at this point in my life, as a senior scholar and member of the Medicare generation, um, I kind of write intuitively. I had the benefit of a very good graduate education and undergraduate education at San Jose State and then at Claremont, where I got my degrees, and then built on it and kept learning, and then discovered that I study hard, and then I kind of let the inspiration flow, and I write about things that I want to write about,
Hmm.
or that on occasion uh, I get a little nudge from the divine, I think, to say I should pay attention to this or I should reflect on this. So I don't blame God for what I've written, but I take responsibility for it. But sometimes it seems as if I'm being inspired, and I try to be inspiring.
Yeah, well, the work definitely comes across that way. So thoroughly enjoyable. And I actually sent this book that we're going to talk about today. I've been sending it to lots of people saying Advent is coming, and this is a wonderful book that could be a companion for you. So I want to pick your brain today, like we talked about Christmas, and in particular about some of the things that stem from your book, from Cosmos to Cradle, meditations on the Incarnation. And before we kind of get into the questions I have, maybe you could just take a moment to tell us a little bit about this book, and in particular, what does that title mean, from Cosmos to Cradle? What is packed into that very small statement?
Well, yeah, and it kind of expresses what I think are the creative tensions in the Christmas story.
Mhm.
Um, for any educated reader of the Gospels, they'll know that each of the Gospels has a different take on it, and one of them doesn't even talk about it at all. That is the
Right.
Gospel of Mark.
Yeah. He just gets right
It,
into
be,
it.
it begins with the baptism of Jesus. But here we have John's gospel, and it talks about, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and it's the creative principle in the universe. Not a word about Bethlehem or
Mhm.
Nazareth or Herod or shepherds or magi. Then we have the two other stories, each of which has its own uh, own perspective. One focuses on Mary and the other focuses on Joseph. One
Hmm.
gives us the shepherds, other gives us the magi. And I like the interplay between the infinite and the intimate.
Mm.
You know, Christianity and Judaism are not about a God in the abstract or a faith history that's in the abstract. It's concrete. And even John's gospel, for all its high flying mysticism and speculative philosophy, says the Word was made flesh. And the minute they say that, the Word was made flesh, all of a sudden we're looking at bodies like our own that grow older, get sick from the various communicable diseases around, wrestle with how to deal with inflation,
Mm.
deal with issues of whether voting is fair or whether voting ends up being minimized by people. It really puts it right where we live.
Yeah.
And the cosmos is the big picture, and that there's something about the cosmos and God's intention that happens in the life and birth of Jesus. There's also something about the birth of Jesus and his life that reveals the cosmos.
Mm.
And you can't do without the other. The only God for Christians, I believe, is a God that is in flesh, a God
Mhm.
with skin, a God whose character is like the character of like Jesus. And yet that character of Jesus is not small but large. It
Mm.
encompasses things that doesn't, as I say in the Elephant is Running, exclude other insights.
Mm.
We can't deny the wisdom of other traditions, but we can say the wisdom that we have is enough to provide a pathway to wholeness for any and everyone who is called to it or who chooses.
Yeah, that's so good. Each chapter or meditation in the book opens with an excerpt from the Gospels. Obviously, not Mark, because like we talked about, Mark isn't really too interested in the birth story. But you have maybe a piece from John's Gospel about the Logos or the Word. You have a section, maybe from Matthew's Gospel or Luke's Gospel, the Nativity story. Each chapter opens with something. So one of the questions I had is like, what do these stories mean to you? So in particular, the nativity story, the virgin birth, the wise men, the star, the shepherds, Herod, all the different things. Many of us were raised like myself to see these as historical events that you never question. It's just like a play
Yes.
by play of what happened to Jesus when he was
Yes.
born. Matthew had his own little version and Luke had his own little version, but we can mash them together and make one big story because that's what it is. So my question is, what role do these stories play in the life and the heart of Bruce Epperly? Is there any historical merit to them? Does it even matter? Take us into that very sticky question.
Well, I'm an old school theologian, and by that I mean that before the modern era, and I'm not I'm a creation of the modern era.
Hmm.
Uh, there was no distinction between theology and spirituality. Um, People's spiritual journeys were articulated in their theological journeys, and vice versa. So I can't separate the heart and the mind. On the one hand, the stories are the stories of my childhood. They're the stories of the events of being a small boy who was surprised on Christmas, a small
Hmm.
boy who asked the year that we were driving down to Los Angeles rather than being at home on Christmas morning, would Santa come today?
Hmm.
Where would Santa be? And discovered that my dad, who had been recording a radio show that evening, then was picking us up to take us to LA. Dropped by the house, it was lit and the presents were under the tree, and that wonderful thing that
Hmm.
Christmas could happen anywhere, Santa could come anywhere.
Yeah.
And so there's that part of it that I try to cherish and try to hold on to, that it's a heart holiday.
Hmm.
It's a hard holiday that anyone who's held a child or been a parent or have had gotten the news that they and their spouse, their partner, are pregnant. That's their story. It's our story.
Hmm.
Anyone who's been an outsider, it's our story. Anyone who struggles with the powers and principalities of the world, that's our story. It's the story of humankind. Now, the historicity of the story is a challenge.
Mhm.
I have to admit that I take very seriously biblical scholarship. I am definitely have been influenced by some of the great scholars in this area: N.T. Wright, John Dominic Crossan, Marcus Borg.
Mhm.
Uh, but yet, I've also felt that when the heart informs those stories, we can't out of hand deny them. I think that it's Leibniz or Spinoza, I think, who says that philosophies err more in what they deny than in what they affirm. It's a grand universe.
Mhm.
It's a universe big enough for a virgin birth. It's not a big part of my faith, I must say. When I go to the evening service with the shepherds and the magi on Christmas Eve at my home church in Bethesda, Maryland, I'm not going to worry about the history. Um, what I'm going to be thinking about is how this is the human story of
Mhm.
about the divine being present in the lives of our that we have of birth, of trying to pay for your children's education, of getting the kid off to school, and in dealing with the political issues of our time. I don't disbelieve in the virgin birth. It's never been my job to be a negative deconstructionist. If anything, I try to be a creative
Mhm.
deconstructionist and say, how could we understand this? Lord knows there are other stories of virgin births, but in a universe like this, in which the very fact that we exist is miraculous, I mean, anyone who goes out at 4 in the morning, as I did, and took a long walk, as I often do every sunrise, and watched the eclipse a couple days ago, you know, that's beyond my imagination, or even ponders that,
Mhm.
13.7 billion years, give or take 100 million among friends. Even that this particular universe came into being, and of course my 10-year-old grandson, who's been raised on Marvel comic books and Marvel movies, talks about the multiverse to me, and all this provokes radical amazement.
Mhm.
When I've studied the best scholarship and take it seriously, but I don't think even that should constrict our thinking. The scholarship is to keep us honest and to give us a playing field, but don't let the imagination be dimmed. So I think it's the story. I'm not worried about whether an angel showed up. I sure as heck don't know the mechanics of the virgin birth. Uh, I have great doubts about the stories of Mary's conception, about how her parents were thinking of God, and somehow or other she was born without the taint of sin. That seems rather like nonsense to me. I think the virgin birth story itself says to us, this is a special child.
Mhm.
It's a little bit like Baby Yoda, maybe, but this is a special child that God has chosen. And I don't think God is a homogenous force, a
Mhm.
force that's even across the universe. I think God's just like us in the sense that some moments of our lives more define us than others,
Yeah.
and some moments of God's relationship. So I believe in the sense that in this prophetic tradition, God could have reached out to people who would be the parents of this special child
Yeah.
and be moving uniquely in their lives, such that Jesus is one of us entirely. Who,
Mhm.
who knows the mechanics of the divine humanity? But Jesus is one of us, and yet called by God to do something unique, just as in our own way, we're called by God to do something unique.
Yeah. I think that's so beautiful. And this is a theme that's been coming up in a lot of conversations on the podcast. So I think it's interesting. It just kind of came up again. It's just that in order to be, there's just like, I guess, this lie out there that in order to be like a serious deconstructionist or a serious progressive Christian, you need to abandon certain ideas and certain things. You need to
Yeah.
toss them aside. But just to hear you say that, like, you don't have to toss aside the virgin birth. You don't have to toss aside these stories that have brought so much light and joy into our lives, especially when we were younger. Like, you don't have to throw all of that away. There is a way to deconstruct. There is a way to move into a more progressive Christian mindset and still hold on to those things. Just think about them very differently than we used to.
Yeah, and I think certain types of progressivism and certain types of conservatism share a common mistake or fallacy of making our world and our imagination smaller.
Yeah.
The attempt to be literalistic in criticizing the text is almost as unimaginative in being literalistic and saying this is the only thing the text is saying.
Hmm.
I think that there's a sense that we're dealing with the imagination here. We're dealing with fantastic things.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's that you can call it the world of myth, but those who've studied Jung and Campbell and others know that myths are never false. They're
Yeah.
oftentimes truer than daily experience. The myth is what allows you, when you look across the room and fall in love, to say, that's the one.
That's right.
The myth is the one that gets you to make a decision to transform your life and transform the world, because even though you don't know the mechanics of what you're going to do, you've been called to save this little part of the world. And because God has called you, even
Yeah.
though you don't know God's name, God has called you.
That's right. Yeah, I was talking to somebody the other day. We were talking about like the big events in the Bible, the virgin birth, the resurrection, and they said to me like, "Do you believe that these things happen?" And I said honestly, like I don't know. Like I used to look at them and say, "Yes, these are historical events," and then I tried to say, "No, they weren't historical events. They didn't really happen." And now I'm in this place where I'm just like, I don't really know if they're historical or not, but I know that they're true because I see virgin birth and resurrection every day. Like I've seen goodness birthed out of darkness. I've seen
Yes.
things come about that have no possible meaning for how they came about. I've seen dead things come back to life in terms of dreams and things like that. Like I think that those things are wired into our very being, and that's what makes them
Yes.
true. But when we get lost in the mechanics of did this happen? How could this possibly happen? I think we lose that wonder and we lose that piece of ourselves in that
Well,
conversation.
yes. I mean, anyone who has been to the hospital with a serious illness knows that the illness is more than the chart.
Right.
Even though when you're being treated for cancer, you look at the chart and look at the numbers to see if you're going in the right direction.
Yeah.
But the chart is also a flesh and blood person who is worried about whether they're going to make it. It's a mother or father, in my case, who's looking at whether a child's going to survive.
That's right.
It's somebody. It's the deeper meaning of events we can never fully fathom. I think that Augustine is correct when he says that if you think you know it fully, it isn't God.
That's right.
And that applies equally to the fundamentalist who thinks they know the text
Yep.
and the deconstructionist who thinks they know the text.
Right.
It's always more. That doesn't mean we don't keep wrestling with the text. The word mystery is not intended for us to abandon our thinking. The
Right.
word mystery says we've got a long journey ahead of us and let's keep going. And even though, as Tolkien says, not all who wander are lost,
Hmm.
we have to wander,
Yeah.
WANDR, and wonder with these stories
Mm,
and keep trying to fathom what part a human can fathom of a cosmic and divine mystery.
that's right. That's so good. So one of the things I love about the book is that there's a lot of one-liners that are very quotable and a lot of
Yeah,
sections that gave me pause, which is probably why it's a book of meditations because the meditations are very short, but I found that I had to really create a lot of space in my time before reading
yeah,
the next one because I had to let it kind of sit and linger for a little bit.
yeah.
And there's just one section where you say, and I have a quote here on my screen. You say, in Jesus, God became human so that humankind might become divine. And I actually wrote that in my journal the morning that I read it because that's a huge statement. And I read it like 2 weeks ago, but
Yeah,
I don't think I've even begun to scratch the surface of what it means. So I was wondering
yeah,
if you could kind of help us unpack that a little bit
sure.
and see where it might lead us. And again, for our listeners, it's in Jesus, God became human so that humankind might become divine. What does that mean?
Yeah, yes, and I am leaning on an ancient tradition, theosis or divinization, that before worrying about sin, the incarnation didn't come because of sin. The incarnation was there long before Adam and Eve showed up.
Hmm.
The word of John's gospel didn't emerge before human sin, because how could it?
Yeah.
In the beginning was the Word. We weren't even a gleam in God's eye at that point. Uh, and that we were created, and however we understand this mysterious language, in the image of God. There's a
Yeah.
Godwardness in everyone. There's a Christwardness in everyone. Luther
Mm.
calls us little Christs. That there's a little Christ in us, and that we are called to be holy in our setting.
Yeah.
Now, that obviously doesn't mean that the church lady of Saturday Night Live from ancient era of that series. It doesn't mean necessarily being prim and proper and just dotting every I and being scrunched up in your life. I
Sure.
think it means being fully human, which is something we barely scratch the surface of.
Yeah.
We sleepwalk through the day. And are convicted when Mary Oliver asks us, what do you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?
Mm.
Uh, and we've realized that we just went through 72 hours where we just kind of went from one thing to another and didn't have a sense of the joy and of that. Again, every morning, again, I tie a lot of my writing to my spiritual practices, and I get up very early, somewhere time between 4 and 5,
Mm.
and after morning prayer and a little study or writing, I go take a walk, and begin the day with just this is the day God has made, and let us rejoice and be glad in it. And I start enumerating the things that are marvelous in the world
Mm.
and in my life. It's you never run out of things to say, and it reminds you you're part of the wonder. I thank God for myself,
Mm.
uh, not because I'm unique, but this morning I woke up
Mm.
and I was thinking and I was creating something and I was bringing something new to the planet. And I think divinization means being fully alive and with all the impediments in life of being fully alive.
Yeah.
And one of Christ's jobs, the atonement again is not necessarily about appeasing the wrath of God. To me, that's a morally suspect notion. But the atonement is about a unity with God that comes through God's presence, even and including the cross,
Mm.
to wake us up to who we are as God's beloved
Mm.
in a world that's God's beloved.
Yeah. That's so good. I've been thinking a lot about like what's the purpose of Jesus, and what was the purpose of the incarnation? Why what is all this about? And what I've come to think about in my own life, and the way that's it's come to make sense to me, is it's almost like Jesus is like God's mirror that he's holding up
Yes,
to the world. And we look at Jesus and we see our reflection. And the hope is that we will sooner than later wake up to that and remember who we are. Because like you said, we
yes,
sleepwalk through life, and we go about our day, and we live in this world, and we pick up baggage. It just sticks to us as we walk through life. And I think it's so easy to forget who we are. Like you said, in Genesis, it says the very first thing is we're made in the image of the divine. And it's so easy to forget that the breath of God has brought us to life. It's so easy to forget that the breath of God is our very makeup. It's easy to forget these things and forget who we are when we look at Jesus and we see his love and his grace and his forgiveness and the things that he stood for and he fought for. Like, it's you're supposed to say, ah, yes, this is what it's all about. And so that's the way I've been seeing Jesus. And I've been trying to explain it to my daughter. She's 5. So we talk about the
yes.
story of Jesus every night before we go to bed. And I try to emphasize that this is because she's going to pick up all that sin talk eventually. But I
Yep.
want her to have like a solid foundation of this is who you are. You are good. You are made in the image of God. We forget it all the time. Daddy forgets it. Mommy forgets it. You're going to
Yep.
forget it. But Jesus, we can look to Jesus and we can remember, yes, that's who I am.
And that's really what these stories are about.
Yeah.
We need the cosmos, but the cradle is the very simple story of a father and mother. Could be two fathers today. It could be two mothers. We won't worry about that sort of thing.
Yep.
Parents loving their child, trying to do what's best for their child, trying to protect their child, and off they run to Egypt, trying to avoid, as asylum seekers, the wrath of the government.
Yep.
This is the story of humans. Mary and Joseph are fallible people, but in that shining moment, they said yes to impossible possibilities, just as sometimes couples who become pregnant, you know, am I up to this?
Yeah.
You know, there's a story circulated in early centuries about Mary, in which God had visited a number of other houses, and she was the first one to say yes.
Mm.
And she wasn't preparing in any intentional way to be the parent of Jesus of Nazareth, nor was Joseph. But when the push came to shove, they said yes to something that was impossible until they said yes to it.
Yeah.
And that may be the story for us. We live in a world of impossibilities till we say yes to the impossible.
That's right.
And then things unfold, and
Yeah.
they parent the child of God.
Yeah. And that's so I mean that's the thing. Like when we what I was saying before is like when we try to analyze the story and figure out the science behind the virgin birth and how in the world this could possibly happen, we lose things like that. We lose the idea that a yes to the impossible could birth something in your life that you have absolutely never imagined in your wildest dreams. And I think that at the heart
Yes,
of it, that's the story because these people who are reading these stories, they needed to hear that with the trials and the tribulations that they were going through in their time to read and to see the story of somebody who said yes to the impossible, birth something new. Imagine what that would have
yes,
done for them in their time.
yes.
Yeah. So good. All right. So Mary, let's talk about Mary for a second. One of the I don't know cornerstone pieces, I guess, of Christmas time in the church and the Christmas play and all that kind of stuff is Mary's Magnificat and this
Yeah,
great song that she supposedly sang when she went to visit Elizabeth. Elizabeth, and one of the things that you
yeah,
say in the book is that her words kind of challenge this idea that there is no connection between spirituality and politics. And you
yeah.
say that not only did Mary not see her words come to fruition, but all these years later, the day after election day, we are still we are still waiting for these words to come to fruition. So this is kind of a loaded question, but you can kind of unpack it as much as you'd like. Can you
Sure.
talk to us a little bit about that song that Mary sang and what that was about, and then maybe
Yeah.
share paint a picture for us. What would it look like for this song to come to fruition? And
Yes.
then
Yes.
how can you and I and everyday people working a 9 to 5 job, trying to pay the mortgage, all those things, how can we help make that happen?
Well, and it's a magnificent song. I mean, that's the
It's
Magnificat.
got a
My
great
soul
title.
magnifies God. And here you have again, who knows whose words these were, but they were certainly the wondrous, may very well have been the wondrous expression of somebody to whom something has happened they can't fully fathom, but they know it changes everything.
Yeah.
And they know that people like them, who are marginalized, who are working folks or people trying to get by, have a different destiny than other people say about them.
Mm.
This even this morning at the grocery store, I quite often shop early in the day if I need a gallon of milk or
The best
something
time to
like
go.
that.
In and
Yeah, it
out.
is. So the my checker, who I've known for 30 years,
Mm.
I moved away from DC, moved back, and there she is, still waiting for me. And she's there, and we began to talk about whether a parent thinking their child was failing because they decided they didn't want to go to college but learn a trade,
Mm.
and how learning a trade seems inferior.
Mhm.
And here you have Mary, the daughter of a tradesperson, most likely,
Yep.
not one of the great ones, forgotten girl. Girls that are pregnant are a dime a dozen then and now. There's nothing special, in quotes, nothing special in quotes. It's everything special in reality. And
Mm.
she imagines a world in which the wealthy somehow rather divest themselves of the gap between wealth and poverty, that the wealthy see themselves in solidarity with the poor, and she's even stronger than that, that God's going to force them to do it,
Mm.
that God's going to change the world so that Elon Musk is living in a shotgun back and forth house with living room, kitchen, bedroom, and and somebody who's been in a hovel will have a nice home. That
Mm.
that God's going to change things. Well, that again is an impossible possibility. We haven't seen it yet on this planet, but we need to hear Mary, just like we need to hear Amos, just like we need to hear Micah and Hosea, and Jesus repeating Isaiah and Luke 4, that this world could come to pass.
Mm,
If we give up on the impossible, the things that haven't happened, we'll be content with the real,
mm,
and the real will all of a sudden, what do they say, is will be the mediocrity that will succumb to less than.
mm,
Uh, the Magnificat calls us to be partners in a world that we can't imagine, a world that will change us, a world in which we may have to give something up. I mean,
mm,
I'm speaking as a privileged white male, knowing that the equalization of life, and as American, uh, will require sacrifice.
mm,
And I'm never quite sure of what that means exactly, but I have to let go of the stranglehold that whiteness has on many people. I have to let go of the stranglehold of patriarchy. And now as an older scholar and as an older pastor, I have to still do the best work I can and get my ego out of the way and step outside so other people can get in there.
yeah.
So that first gay person can be a governor in Massachusetts like Maura Healey. So that first transgendered person can have a responsible position and maybe even get one that I might be interested in.
Mm,
And not fall into the world of complaints
mm.
and being what do they call it, a snowflake about somebody else. Yes. I mean, you hurt if you don't get the job, but if you realize that sometimes you have to step over,
Mm,
and the wealthy have to be uh, become, Mary says, compassionate to the point of sacrifice.
yeah.
The wealthy have to become compassionate to the point of getting out of the way. The powerful have to be
Mm,
compassionate to the point of stepping aside and letting others have power.
mm.
And that's the ideal world that seems so far from ours right now, both in the international and the domestic sphere, and even in the church.
Mm,
What
yeah.
if we let go, and as the old saying goes, let God lead the way? That's what she's telling us to do, with no clear sense of where it's going to go.
Mm. Yeah, and that's what we often want the map laid out. We want to know
Yeah.
if we do this, where's this going to take us? And we don't get that. But if I'm hearing you correct, and I just wrote this down what you said before, is that if we give up on the impossible, we become comfortable with the real. And this idea, I guess this idea, and correct me if I'm going the wrong way with this, but Mary's song contains a lot of things that seem to be impossibilities on the
Yes.
surface. Just like
Yes.
we're talking about the virgin birth, the resurrection, all these different things, it seems impossible. How could this possibly be? But if we give up on that, if we say, well, that's impossible, then we become
Yeah.
comfortable with the way that things are, with the rich living the richest extravagant lifestyles
Yes.
while everybody else is trying to make ends meet. And then you have people who have absolutely nothing at all. And so we
Yes.
become comfortable with that because, well, the impossible is impossible. So the question then, if I could dig a little bit deeper, is how do we let ourselves live into that impossible? Like, think about the person, like I said before, who's working a 9 to 5 job. They're trying to
Yes.
make ends meet. They're trying to raise their kids, pay the mortgage, pay the bills, and they read Mary's song during Advent. They come across
Yes.
this. What can they do to live into the impossible so they don't become comfortable with the way things are?
Yes. And far be it from me to prescribe what another should be doing. But
I want
I
the
live with
blueprint,
this.
Bruce. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I live with this every day, in the sense of saying, speaking to myself,
Yeah.
with all my egocentricity and self-interest that's built into being a human to some
Mhm.
extent, survival needs, is how can I have a bigger imagination, a more open heart, a more sacrificial spirit,
Yeah.
a more willingness to let go of my agenda for a larger one. Now, this for me, and for people like me, and for people who have power, means helping facilitate the ability of people who are just barely getting by in terms of time and energy and income to have leisure and largesse to think bigger.
Mhm.
I think Howard Thurman makes the comment that one of the greatest tragedies of poverty is the stifling of the imagination.
Mm.
Uh,
Right.
and we need to you're thinking of about a child going to kindergarten, for example. He, she, they need to have a big imagination. They need to imagine things that couldn't possibly happen. They need to run down the hallway of their parents, their home, shouting Luke Skywalker with their lightsaber. They need to imagine hitting the home run to win the World Series.
Yeah.
They need to imagine being the first woman president. They need to imagine that, or it isn't going to happen.
Yeah.
And we have to make sure that the imagination is big enough. And for those of us who we need to work toward a society where people in those 9 to 5, or some days now 9 to 8 jobs,
Mm-hmm.
have enough leisure to dream,
Yeah.
have enough leisure to say that there's more to life. I have nothing against Miller time, but there's more to your calling on this planet than knocking down a few beers after work.
That's right.
And it's in our hearts to do so, and it almost has to be a social calling. That's why I think Mary's call is initially for the wealthy to imagine themselves different,
Yeah.
the people of privilege to imagine themselves in our society different, and the marginalized to imagine it could happen and try to ask themselves, in what small way can I make this happen this day? I think it's in the Jewish tradition, of a Kabbalistic tradition, that they say that when a soul is saved, it's as if the world is saved. When soul is destroyed, it's as if the world destroyed. I think a little bit like the one day at a time from the 12-step movement. That's too generous.
Yeah.
I think that you have to ask each other and ask ourselves, how are we going moment by moment to save the particular situation I am in right now? I mean, I hold on to God's way in a very precarious fashion. Somebody pulls in front of me while I'm driving, and I no longer think of what I'm called to be. And I'm no longer thinking of saving that encounter as I yell at somebody who does that. I mean, I think the moment by moment by moment by moment, living with the sense of God's presence and purpose, that this is the moment I'm called to be in. And that really takes a type of intentionality. And I think one of the things we can do in the life of the church, of religious communities, is to invite people to be intentional about how they live their life, how they live the day, this particular day that we're in, this particular moment they're in, which kind of combines again the infinite and the intimate.
Mm.
The infinite, the wide horizon. I'm what does Paul say? I'm pushing toward the goal. I've got my eye on the prize,
Yeah.
but the prize is in this very moment.
Yeah. That's so good. It's funny, we think of questions like this, and we want to we want to attack the big issues. We want to see global change come. We want to be able to, make a huge impact on some big issue that's going on. But like you said, we can focus on those things so much and become so overwhelmed with the impossibility of it that we forget about the moment to moment things that we can do every single day that can cause a ripple effect. You never know what your act of kindness, or like your act of pausing for a moment before you lose your cool, and the way that you respond to somebody, that could change their approach to how they're going to approach the next
Yes,
person and the person after that. You just have no idea. But if we focus on those moment to moment things, I think that's where the real change can happen.
I think so. For most of
Yeah.
us, we have to hold the two in creative tension, to have the long sense of what we can become,
Yeah.
and the short step sense of one step at a time.
That's right. That's right. All right. Last question for you. From Pastor Bruce's heart. The people who are listening are your congregation right now, and they've come for a word, I guess you could say, for Christmas. If you had everybody here on the mic with you and everybody was listening live with me, what would you say to them as they go their way? Because Christmas is a time, holidays are a time where people Some people love it, some people dread it because you got family things, you've got
Yes.
past events and baggage, and you've got people maybe who passed away during holiday time. So it brings up a lot of different stuff. But if you had to
Yeah.
leave us all with a message, what would that be?
Yes. Yeah, and that's a wonderful question that's very current because this year the Christmas day falls on Monday, falls on Sunday, just as New Year's Day falls on Sunday.
Mm,
And I've been noticing a number of churches are going to move away from in-person worship on Christmas Day.
mm,
And our denomination, the United Church of Christ, the conference has offered to have a Zoom service that you can download for your church.
mm,
And that bothers me. That bothers me. I know the intention. So
mhm.
I've let my name be known that I'd be willing to show up in a local church on Christmas morning and New Year's morning because I know the low Sunday can be a high Sunday.
Yeah.
I think that Christmas Eve, Christmas morning, the whole season of 12 days, the whole season of 12 days, it should be. One of my friends says that there should be 2 weeks of Advent and 4 weeks of Christmas, and she
Mm.
may be right on that point, is to basically say there's a light here. And
Yeah.
there's a light within you. There's a light in the world that can guide our path if we open our eyes to it. I think it's Amanda Gorman who said in an inauguration poem for President Biden to see the light and to be the light.
Mhm.
To know that in this little world in which we find ourselves with all its struggles, something marvelous is happening. The mere fact of being alive today is a wonder. The mere fact of waking up to this day is a wonder. The mere fact that God is with you in working wherever you are, whether it's as a cashier at Walmart or as a pastor struggling with the extra services during Advent and Christmas, whether it's been a person trying to combine working, going to soccer games,
Mhm.
et cetera, taking the kids to school, that these are the places, oh, little town of Bethlehem, descend upon us this day, cast out
Mm.
our sins and enter in, be born in us today.
Yeah.
That Christ can be born in these situations that we find ourselves, and that this is really an evangelical message. This is more than the four spiritual laws. This is the four spiritual laws are kind of kid stuff
Mm.
compared to this. This is the right here. You've got a calling from Jesus right here. Jesus is being born, and get on with it, and wake up from your slumber. As again, I think of uh, William Blake. If the doors of perception were opened, we'd see everything as it is, as
Mm.
infinite. It's already here. Christ
Yeah.
is born. Hallelujah.
That's right. Amen to that. Well, Bruce, we are just about out of time again. Our time together goes so fast. But thank you so much for taking the time to join me, and thank you for giving us this perspective on my favorite holiday, my favorite time of the year. But thank you so much.
It was a joy to be with you. We'll do it again.
You got to put all your links in the show notes, and I'll be in touch because there's more books.